Can everybody hear me with this? Okay. A little bit. Okay. Great. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. It's wonderful to have a gathering space for an event like this, for what's happening through the weekend, and especially for this gathering here today, right now. I think we're really, really very privileged to have Will Tuttle here in Mendocino County for this weekend to visit and to share his presence with us. He's one of our really important teachers and healers that we have with us too. He has a really wonderful resume. He has not the least of which is that he's been a vegan for 29 years. He's been an animal rights activist and a peace activist and a writer for about 20 years. He's also an educator, a composer, a pianist, and a writer. He holds a PhD in education from the University of California at Berkeley, focusing on educating intuition and altruism. He's taught college courses in philosophy, humanities, mythology, and comparative religion. He is also a Zen priest and Dharma master in the Korean Zen tradition. He's the author of The World Peace Diet, Eating for Spiritual Health, really beautiful book. He's the recipient of the Peace Abbey's Courage of Conscience Award, and also co-founder of the Prayer Circle for Animals and the Circle of Compassion Ministry. He's presented concerts, lectures, and seminars throughout North America and Europe. Currently, he's conducting a music, art, and education ministry with his wife, Madeline, who is also a visionary artist from Switzerland. Will devotes his life to providing uplifting and healing original music and to helping people awaken their inner wisdom and compassion. Most of all, I think Will is one of those very special people that we have in our world who lends his vision and his light to really helping to facilitate the evolution of our species and our planet. He uses his words, his music, and his presence all take us deeper within ourselves so that we can find new ways of being in the world as we move through it from day to day. So I think it's a really wonderful event to have Will Tuttle here with us today. So please help me welcome him.
Thank you so much, Jan. She's doing tremendous work. I really encourage everyone to check out Jan's table if you want to understand how to feed your companion animals healthy and compassionate and wise choices for food. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us here this afternoon. And one of the main themes, I think, really for this talk that I'm going to be giving now is a saying by Krishnamurti. He said that it's not a good idea to be well-adjusted to a sick society. I think it really bears repeating. It's not a good idea to be well-adjusted to a sick society. And I think all of us, if we're in this room or watching this, have a story. You have some kind of a journey that you've been going on, and I think the core of that journey in many ways is questioning the official story of this culture. And once we start to question the official story of our culture and start to question the underlying assumptions of this culture, then our spiritual path actually begins. If we haven't started questioning the underlying assumptions of this culture, then we're not actually, I don't think, on a spiritual path, because we're basically living out the conditioning and the stories that we've heard without questioning them and without really learning to rely on a deeper level of consciousness, what we could call our intuition or our own inner wisdom. And I think it's people doing that create the possibility for our culture to evolve. And that's the only reason I think we've been able to make some progress in the abolition of slavery and injustice and so forth over the years. But I think, am I okay as far as, maybe I should be closer. I think that our culture right now, we all know this, is in a crisis, that we cannot just make little superficial changes in the ways that we're living that what we're really called for as a culture is an essential, deep change. And so the basic place I'm coming from in giving this talk and also living my life is that our culture yearns for a benevolent revolution in consciousness, a transformation essentially in how we're living. And I would call that the vegan revolution. Vegan meaning, I think in many ways, ahimsa. Does anyone know ahimsa? Ahimsa is an ancient Sanskrit word that means non-violence. And it's really the foundation of most of the Asian spiritual traditions. And I think actually it's embedded in the Western traditions as well. Ahimsa, which means non-violence, is a teaching that I will never be happy as long as I'm violent. I'll never be happy as long as I'm sowing seeds of violence towards others. And so the whole idea is to practice ahimsa, to practice non-violence and compassion in our daily lives. And food is probably, in this culture, the most violent dimension. We are right now in the United States killing 75 million animals every single day for food. Right? Okay, we've got about 300 million people. We are killing 75 million animals daily, routinely. It's an ongoing thing going on. It's like we have a curtain, and behind the curtain, you're not supposed to look behind the curtain. You look behind the curtain, we have whole armies of our brothers and sisters that do nothing other than hyper-confine, mutilate, castrate, and kill animals, for food. And we see it packaged in nice little packages in stores and restaurants and so forth, and given names that sound, that don't really tell what it is. And so our children are indoctrinated, all of us have been actually, if we're in this culture, into seeing ourselves essentially as predatory. That we're eating the flesh and secretions of animals that have been confined and brutalized, and we're taught that this is natural, that this is right, this is the way God wants us to live, and so forth. And so this essential orientation is ritually injected into everyone as we're growing up by our parents, and it was injected into them, and it's gone through the centuries for between 8,000 and 10,000 years. It's been going on. It's not something that's been going on, forever. We can trace it, and it's very interesting to do that. So, what I'd like to do this afternoon, I feel that I have way more information that I would like to impart to you than I have time to do it in. That's the essential dilemma that I feel myself. I mean, the book that we just heard about, The World Peace Diet, it's about 350 pages. The editors told me you can never repeat anything. They reduced it from 400 to 350. And we recently made it into an audio book, and it's 13 and a half hours long. Right? So I have just maybe 45 minutes here. So I'd like to just touch on some of the main points, and hope that in your own lives you can continue to do more research and to really sort of deepen your understanding of this, because I really truly believe there is nothing more powerful, more empowering, more liberating than this understanding. This understanding is the most taboo subject there is in this culture. And the reason I think it's so taboo is that the power elite does not want this talked about. And most of us don't. We've so inculcated the values of disconnectedness and reductionism and violence towards female animals and animals in general in nature that we don't want to hear about it either. So I think you all show enormous courage and actually just spiritual receptivity to be interested in this subject, because this is the place, this is the living core of our culture. And if we ignore this, which unfortunately, as Madeline and I travel around, I speak a lot at for environmental groups, social justice groups, peace groups, and pretty much they're eating meat, dairy, and eggs and working for equality, environmental sustainability, and justice, and they don't seem to make the connection that killing all these animals actually has enormous reverberations. The repercussions are incredible, and they're really fascinating to look at. And so in the World Peace Diet, that's really the essential core, is to just follow, just look at mindfully, just basically practice mindfulness in eating and see what are the reverberations of our food choices. When we choose to eat animal foods, what happens? When we choose to eat plant foods, what happens? And it's amazing to find out what it does to our physical health, but at a deeper level, what it does to our cultural health, to the health of the ecosystems, to our own spiritual health and to our psychological health. I think these are dimensions that really have not been discussed nearly enough. And so what Madeline and I are trying to do as we travel around is to just raise consciousness about the basic fact that we cannot be physically healthy if we're living in a sick society, on a sick planet, and practicing attitudes and behaviors that are devastating, that are not in alignment with our true nature, which is nonviolence. I think at our very core, probably for tens of thousands of years before our culture began this herding of animals, we lived in a way that was far more wise and far more in alignment with the truth that we are. So the basic idea here is that all of us have been born into a culture that has a hidden core. The hidden core that is a taboo to talk about is essentially a core of reductionism. That certain beings are routinely and systematically reduced from the status of being beings, sacred beings, who have a purpose, who have feelings, and who have interests, who have interests in their lives. Like if I have a companion dog, we all know that they have interests, that they have yearnings and desires. If you step on their tail, they say, stop. And that like them, we also have interests, but that these interests and the basic view that we have of them has been changed in an essential way from seeing them as beings to seeing them merely as commodities. So essentially we're born into a culture that injects into all of us a mentality of commodification, of turning beings into commodities. And the essential core of all of this is that whatever we put out will come back. Okay, so if you look at all the religious and spiritual teachings of this planet, and if you try to sum up the essential teaching of all of these religious traditions into one sentence, I believe it would be this. And that is, whatever you most want for yourself, give it to others. Whatever you most want for yourself, give that to others. If you want to be loved, be loving. If you want to be free, free others. If you want to be blessed, bless others. This is the joy that we all find. I think we all know at an essential level that we're here for a purpose, and our purpose is to connect with our own unique way of blessing the world, and that if we find that, and as we find that and we contribute our blessing, we feel a sense of joy. And if we're not living our purpose, then there's a sense of frustration, and we then try to consume in order to fulfill that frustration, and that works great for the corporation. So they don't want us to talk about this core of satisfaction and joy, which is to find our purpose and to live our purpose. And I believe our culture has lost its purpose essentially because we chronically steal the purposes of other living beings. And as we steal their purpose, as we plant the seeds of stealing the purposes of others, we reap the rewards of that, which is we lose our own purpose. And our purpose becomes to consume, and we are devastating this planet through consumption, overconsumption. And it's probably nothing more violent in terms of consumption than eating the flesh of animals and dairy products, because it takes so much land, so many resources, as you all, I'm sure, know this, so much petroleum. There's a whole chapter in the book that basically goes into the environmental devastation of choosing foods that are based on animals. And while people are starving, obviously, for the grain and vegetables and so forth that the land could provide, we are eating meat, dairy, and eggs. So it's a mentality of reductionism, of commodification, of disconnectedness. We learn early on to disconnect from what we're doing. My mother, for example, as I was growing up, never told the true names of things. She said, "We're having bacon and eggs this morning." She didn't say, "Well, we're having the flesh of a brutalized animal and some vaginal secretions." We're just told that we're having these things, and so we don't think what we're really eating. We disconnect from it, and we want to do that. And so I think what we have to realize is that there's an old saying. Madeline taught me this in German. You want to say it? Right. Übung macht den Meister. Practice makes the master. Whatever we practice. So if we routinely practice disconnecting at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, for 20 or 30 years, we become as a culture masters of disconnecting. We can be devastating the rainforests in South America and other places, devastating the oceans, and we just disconnect. We have starving people, we just disconnect. We don't think about it, we just learn. We're so good at disconnecting and just focusing on what we want to focus on and not being aware of the reverberations and the repercussions of our actions. So it's a mentality of disconnectedness. It's also a mentality of elitism. This is the core of elitism. The basic idea that certain beings are here to be used by other beings. And chickens, fish, cows, turkeys, and other animals, fish, are seen as mere, just as meat, basically. So it's also a mentality of materialism, that whatever we see is, if you can't measure it scientifically, then it doesn't exist. This is the essential core of eating meat and dairy and eggs in a culture, is you learn to look with an eye that sees in a very shallow way. You don't look deeply and see the life and the energy and the incredible power and beauty and sacredness. You just learn to see with an eye that just sees dead things that you can commodify and see in terms of economic balance sheets. And so it's also a mentality of predation, that we're essentially predatory because we're given, as soon as we lose our mother's breast, which actually, unfortunately, many people never even get that today, but in any event, when we start eating solid food, which we get from our mothers and fathers and from everyone in our culture, neighbors and relatives and teachers and ministers, all the institutions in our culture are in complete agreement. They don't disagree. Science and religion do not disagree. There's this whole idea, the battle between science and religion. They don't disagree at all about the core of our culture, which is that beings are here for us to use. And so, as little kids growing up, we lose our mother's breast, and every institution in our culture agrees that we are all essentially predatory and we start feeding our children the flesh of these animals. And so if you just go to any grocery store and look in the aisles of the grocery store where the baby food is, you will see veal, chicken, turkey, beef, cheese. All this stuff is being, again, forced into children who grow up and force it to their children, and this is what happens. And there are the repercussions of this are astronomical, and yet it's just, again, routinely ignored by our culture. And we wonder why we've made so little progress creating a culture of equality and peace and sustainability, and we don't realize that we are repeating the very behaviors that create a mentality of commodification, violence, domination, exploitation, predation, disconnectedness. This is what's happening. When we go outside this door and we see the people who are living here and they're eating animal foods, there's not one person who's doing that who is doing it from their own free choice, right? This is sort of just decided on their own to eat the flesh of animals or dairy products or eggs. Everyone is forced into it, not only by our parents and ministers, all the different traditions, but on an ongoing way by the massive media complex. And there's, literally billions of dollars are spent in advertising by the meat and dairy and egg industries, by what I call in the World Peace Diet the military, industrial, meat, medical, pharmaceutical media complex. I mean, it's a huge complex. It's vast. And the interconnectedness of this complex, it requires people who don't question, the most obvious things of what are we designed to actually be eating. What are the repercussions of enslaving millions and hundreds of millions of acres of land to monocultures where you grow nothing but corn and soybeans to feed to animals who are hyper-confined in these stinking sheds, and then you eat that stuff, and the kinds of drugs that these animals are forced to eat, and the sowing of seeds of drugs to animals and how it comes back to ourselves, and this whole interconnection. So once we start down the path of questioning food, we actually will find ourselves drawn into questioning, if we go deeply, questioning the core of our culture. And when we do that, we become a force to be reckoned with. We become a force to heal this planet. And I think there's nothing more powerful than anyone can do to help transform our culture and bring about the new world that I think we all know has to happen if we're going to continue to survive on this planet and really fulfill our destiny as human beings, than to switch to a plant-based diet and do it for reasons not just my own self-centered, I want to be healthy. That's great, but to see the bigger picture that we're all interconnected, that the more I help others be happy. I mean, people are starving to death while we're feeding flesh to animals. Animals are being devastated. Not only, and it's interesting, it's not just the animals themselves, right? The pigs, chickens, and cows that are locked away in these stinking sheds and being slaughtered, but all of nature is affected by that. We have to really understand that. The water, as we travel around, Madeline and I, when we live actually in a solar-powered RV, and we just give lectures, travel slowly around the United States, spreading this a very dangerous doctrine here, I guess. And I think one of the things we see more and more is how the waters are polluted by what's called, euphemistically, nutrient-rich runoff, from all these fields where there's millions of tons of nitrogen-based fertilizers are routinely dumped on them to grow, again, grains, and a lot of chemical pesticides and insecticides are dumped on them. And this practice of monocropping is the driving force behind the loss of habitat for wild animals. One of the things that Madeline loves, and I do too, actually, is what we call wildlife. Animals that are living out there, birds, mammals, fish, animals that are celebrating their lives in nature. And as human beings, we have this idea that somehow they don't even count. If they're either beings that we eat in hyper-confine, or else we get rid of them. They're pests. They may be, all the coyotes and foxes and bears and birds of different kinds maybe they'll interfere with our livestock or with our fields, so we just try to get rid of them. We have a department in the United States called the Department of Wildlife Services. Right? It sounds like, they serve wildlife. Well, yeah, they do. They basically slaughter millions of animals every year, working on behalf of ranchers. But one of the reasons we try to promote the consciousness of wildlife is that we are now in the middle of, I hope it's the end of, but maybe it's hard to say, the largest extinction of species that this planet has ever gone through, at least in the last 65 million years. It's entirely caused by human activity. It's driven by eating animals because we actually go down to South America quite a bit, and we can see the complete devastation of rainforests in South America not only for grazing but for growing soybeans. And people have the mistaken idea that that's somehow for tofu, and it's not. Soybeans, 95%, probably more, probably 97% of soy production is directly for animal feed. Some of it is for low-grade human feed, I guess you could say too. But very little is actually for higher quality food for humans directly. It's really for fattening up animals. And so I think what we have to understand is that the dilemma that we face is really essentially around food. And that once we begin to understand this and make our changes in our own lives and begin to spread this to others, we are doing something that is more valuable, I think, than anything else we can do in terms of helping our culture to make a transformation. And what I'd like to do, I think, briefly is go through some of the main ideas in the book in a chapter-by-chapter basis, just to touch on a few of the highlights so you can get a sense of how these connections are made. The very first chapter is called Food's Power. And I've already talked somewhat about that, but the basic idea is to understand that food, we tend to think in our culture that food is no big deal. Because we're eating while we're driving and we're eating while we're, having a business meeting or something. We just kind of don't want to think, I think, where our food's coming from, so we just think food's not a big deal. But every culture has realized that food is a huge deal. Food is our most intimate connection with the larger order. It's seen as a very spiritual activity, eating is. It's where the infinite universe feeds itself with itself through us. It connects us with an incredibly powerful cosmic activity. And it's a transpersonal activity. It's incredibly spiritually significant. It's the only place, for example, that all cultures have prayers. Really, it's just two times. One is when people die. The other is when people eat. These are the times when every culture offers prayers and to connect with the larger wisdom. And it's also, interestingly enough, when I took courses at UC Berkeley in anthropology, it's very interesting to also realize that every culture, the main way that every culture transmits its values to the succeeding generations is through food, is through the meals. That's where the mores and norms and values are contained in living rituals. These are the rituals of our culture, the most powerful rituals, and we learn through rituals of what animals are, what we are, what our relationship to animals is, what our relationship to the earth is, what our relationship with each other and the larger order is through food. So we have to look deeply into food to understand our culture and ourselves. It's incredibly powerful, and again, it's been routinely ignored. The next chapter is called The Roots of Our Culture, and I'll just say very briefly because I think this is something I don't want to just miss talking about. And the basic idea is that about 8,000 years ago in what is today Iraq, interestingly enough, was what I think was the last revolution that our culture ever experienced. And what happened was people started, first I think it was wild sheep, and then a little bit later wild goats, started to own them as property. And so once that happened, they were reduced. And this was a revolution that took a long time. People talk about the Industrial Revolution and these other revolutions, scientific revolution. They were not revolutions. We can eat more animals even faster than ever. Right? The last revolution, I think, was this herding revolution. And it took thousands of years. And what basically happened was certain animals were reduced in their stature. They became property. They became wealth. And a class of people emerged who owned the animals. Animals were wealth. These were the wealthy herders that emerged. Again, this took thousands of years. These became the kings. Their wealth was the animals that were owned, the sheep and goats and then cows and other animals that were consumed ritually as the fatted calf and so forth. And what happened with this whole thing, again, it took thousands of years, was that women's status was reduced because women up until that point had been powerful. They gave birth. I mean, this was something that was a powerful mystery that was revered. But as men over the centuries began more and more to dominate sheep and goats and then cows, they began to see the female function as something to be dominated, that giving birth was something to be dominated, that babies were something to be stolen, and that they would try to basically manipulate the female animals to to have babies that would have more wool, more flesh, and more milk. This was the first science. Our science is basically, from the very beginning, about dominating nature and dominating the feminine principle, about controlling. We have to really understand this. And it's been used in that way. And its use backfires. The same thing happens to us. And so this is what started happening. Men had to change. Men gradually had to be taught. Role models more and more for little boys growing up were of the hard, tough man, disconnected from his feelings, capable of sustained violence, capable of castrating and mutilating animals, killing them, fighting against other herders. The fastest way to get rich quick for the kings that emerged was for them to go and attack another wealthy guy that had a lot of goats and sheep. And if they won this battle that they would have, and this is the beginning of war, basically. The very first word for war on this planet that we know of is the ancient Sanskrit word gavya, which literally translates meaning the desire for more cows. It's the first word for war. And so they engage in these horrible wars. If whoever lost the war, all of the women would be enslaved. They'd become concubines. The men would be castrated and enslaved. The animals would become property of the people who won. And this culture spread. It spread around the Eastern Mediterranean. It conquered others. It spread around Europe, all around. They came here. They brought the practices here of dominating and using animals for food, and the whole mentality of that. And it's still spreading to this day through McDonald's, through Burger King, through ConAgra, through Monsanto, through this, as I call it, the military-industrial meat-medical complex. And we're born into that culture, and I think we have to realize that this culture has an obsolete set of beliefs. I mean, the violence that is involved at the very core of this culture creates a situation for us today that we have to change that. We have to go forth, and the beauty is that we can. And the beauty is that all of us can live a life of kindness and compassion, and we can let go of this ancient way, this old way of being that has the roots of suicide and devastation. So there's a chapter basically that goes into, and I've just done a kind of a poor, I guess, job of giving you the history of this, but it's really interesting to understand this essential truth that we have not always been at war, we have not always been dominating females. That it's just a relatively recent phenomenon, and our true nature, I think we all know this in our core. Every tradition emphasizes this. I was a Zen monk in Korea, and the teaching in the Zen Buddhist tradition is that we should aspire to what's called the bodhisattva ideal. A bodhisattva is someone who lives their life to bless the world, to bless others. And I think we all know that this is what our true nature actually is. So the next few chapters go into how it is that we begin to eat animal foods and what the repercussions of that are for us as a culture. Then there's a chapter that's called The Intelligence of Human Physiology, which I think you especially will find very interesting. It's what are we actually designed to eat, and to go deeply into our dentition, the whole physiology that we have, and to look at what we're designed to eat. And it's so empowering to realize that we are designed to eat foods that do not cause any suffering to other living beings in any way. That all of the nutrients that we could ever possibly want, we can get through plant-based sources, and to just understand this at a deep level so that we can also share these ideas with others. There's a chapter called Hunting and Herding Sea Life, which goes into what happens in the oceans. Most people don't realize, I don't think, that about 50%, between 50 and 60% of all of the fish that are caught are fed to chickens and pigs and cows. And so the oceans are being completely devastated for fish to try to meet an absolutely astronomical demand for fish, because we're not just eating them directly, we're feeding them to the millions of animals and to fatten them up. In other words, you cannot get a cow, for example. On a dairy today, cows would normally give about 25 pounds of milk a day, in a kind of a bell-shaped curve that would last maybe 4 to 5 months in nature. They're giving over 100 pounds of milk a day for a longer period of time after their babies are stolen. They're pregnant and lactating simultaneously. How do you get a cow to give so much milk? There's two things. One is you feed them hormones, which is done a lot, as you know, and the other is you feed them meat. The scientists discovered that if you feed cows a lot of meat, a lot of cholesterol and animal protein, they give a lot. They get bigger mammary glands, and they give more milk, which is enormously painful to them. It causes osteoporosis and mastitis and a lot of other problems. But so cows actually eat more fish than humans do in the United States, and so do pigs actually, and chickens. So there's a whole chapter that helps us connect with the oceans. There's also, I think, there's an understanding I think we have to have that whatever we put out there comes back, and so I talk a little bit about this, and I'd like to just share this with you right now, this basic idea that, and it's so interesting because, I could go through an entire cycle of education and no one ever talked about this, and I think in a way it's the most obvious thing. I think if someone came from outer space and landed on the Earth and just said, well, so what are they doing here on this planet? I think the most obvious thing is, well, you got these people, and they're eating a lot of animals, and they've got these, and and most of their land is to feed these animals, while other people are starving, and then they eat all these animals, and then they get very sick from that. It would be the most obvious thing, right? But what's not so obvious, I think, is how it boomerangs back at us in a whole variety of ways. For example, obesity. If you look on a graph of obesity, it's just going up and up and up, right? Well, what do we do to animals for food? And we feed them special diets to make them as fat as possible, as quickly as possible, and we make them obese. And when we do that, we sow the seeds of obesity. And, they're sold by the pound, so we just try to make them very fat. And chickens are fattened up in only 6 weeks and killed. 6 weeks old, and they're just babies. And this is true with all the animals. And so we sow seeds of obesity, and lo and behold, we reap seeds of obesity. We sow seeds of osteoporosis massively, especially to female animals, especially to dairy cows and to hens that are used for eggs, because we force them to overproduce, as I was just talking about. And so they're giving much more milk, a lot more eggs than they ever would in nature. And so it's leaching all the calcium out of their bones to give all this milk. Dairy industry crows about how we get all this calcium in milk. The dairy cows who would normally live 20 or 25 years in the wild, by the time 4 or 5 years has gone by, they are so worn out, they have such severe osteoporosis that they can't function anymore. And so we sow seeds of osteoporosis in them, and we reap it in ourselves. As we sow, we will reap. And we have scientists that are looking for cures to osteoporosis and looking for cures to obesity. We don't realize the insanity of the cultural that we're living in and the blindness of the essential truth that what we put out will come back. And slaughterhouse workers say that when dairy cows come to the slaughterhouse, they can break their bones in their bare hands. They have such severe osteoporosis. This is what we're doing to these animals. And even on organic dairies, they are allowed to feed blood to the babies. They don't have to give any milk to the babies on organic dairies, or especially in commercial dairies. So the cruelty involved and the violence involved, this also comes back to us. We have to realize that as we sow, we will reap. So for another really serious problem in this culture that's getting worse, I think, every year, is the breakdown of the family. More and more we see the breakdown of the family system breaking down more and more. And people are thinking, how can we solve this problem? What are we doing to animals by the billions every single, constantly? There is no family, right? In animal agriculture in this country, every single animal is reduced to a lone unit of production in a heartless economic system. The babies are stolen from their mothers. They're either killed. Very often they were fed back to their own mothers to be eaten. This is standard procedure on dairies until we've discovered it causes mad cow disease. But this is the system we're born into, and we don't realize that we're sowing seeds of the breakdown of the family, of massive drug addiction. There's over 10,000 different pharmaceutical drugs that have been approved to be used on for animal production. And so the pharmaceutical companies are making billions of dollars selling pharmaceuticals in animal agriculture, and then human beings get the same kinds of problems, right? We have people with anxiety, they can't sleep, insomnia, depression, the very things that these billions of animals are experiencing themselves that we force onto these animals, and we find psychologically we have the same exact problems, and the pharmaceutical industries are raking it in by the billions, on both sides, on the animals and on the humans that are causing it and reaping that themselves. And it's not talked about. You can't talk about it anywhere. It's just completely taboo subject. And so this, I think, is the essential dilemma that our culture faces, is that we are sowing these seeds rampantly of violence and war and drug addiction and the breakdown of the family. And every single problem that we ever hear about on TV, we are doing it to animals for food. Every single one. Just think about it. And yet no one can talk about it. It's amazing. I could go through an entire cycle of education, get a PhD at the #1 ranked school of education in North America, UC Berkeley, and read hundreds of books and all this, and never read one sentence in all of that research and reading that said, well, maybe the reason we have all these problems is the massive and routine violence towards animals for food. It's an unthinkable thought in this culture. Even the most radical, Noam Chomsky or whoever you can think of, they never say this. They never think of this. It's incredible to me that this is the most obvious thing, and it's absolutely we can't even talk about it. And how are we going to solve these problems that we're having if we don't recognize the driving fury at the core of our culture that's keeping this whole thing going? So that's, I think, what we have to understand. There's a chapter that it's called The Domination of the Feminine. I've already talked about that essentially. But basic idea is, we have science and religion, sort of battling with each other, and people think that they're sort of against each other. They're not at all. I call them the two bickering brothers. They both agree, basically. Who both of them attack is what I call Sophia, which is the essential feminine wisdom that's within all of us that would essentially question this whole thing. And they both attack Sophia. And so I think we have to realize that what we're doing to female animals, from the very beginning, it was the female animals that had been most brutalized in this whole system, because it was their, and the most intimate dimension of female animals. I think we all know in our bones that if there's anything at all that we should have respect for and not mess with, it's mothers giving birth to their babies, nesting with those babies, nurturing those babies, giving them their milk and so forth. We should have a little respect and let that be, right? No. That is the core of this whole system. That is what we most violently and brutally dominate, and we have to disconnect from Sophia to do it, from our own inner wisdom, and so it's easy for us to do all kinds of other violence. And it's this loss of the feminine wisdom that has to be regained in this culture. And it's not going to happen if we continue eating these foods, which are products of that and reinforce the whole thing. Dairy must be the worst of all. Dairy and eggs, because these are the worst domination of the feminine principle, where the baby is routinely stolen, the females are repeatedly raped. There's nothing more violent than we can think of. And yet this is the thing that people somehow think, well, it's okay, So I think we have to understand what's happening actually behind the scenes. There's a chapter called The Metaphysics of Food, that we're not just eating physical toxins, which I think you'll hear about that a lot in this weekend, the physical toxins that exist in foods, but metaphysical toxins like grief and fear and terror and pain and anxiety and panic and all these things, that food should be grown with love and kindness and compassion. From the beginning, there's been two kinds of agriculture: animal agriculture and plant agriculture. And plant agriculture, from the beginning, was mainly women's work, and it brings out the best in us. We're working with the cycles of nature. We're taking care of plants. It's nurturing and blessing the world. And we know now more and more, it's so fascinating, that we can feed everyone on this planet much more efficiently with local organic gardens. We can feed everyone. This has been proven. And I can talk a long time about that. But the other kind of agriculture is animal agriculture, which from the beginning was mainly men's work, and it brings out the worst in us. The animals from the very beginning did not want to be confined. They did not want to have their babies stolen. They always resisted. They're still resisting, and we have to use violence and force. It's the only way. They've always been completely overwhelmed by violence. So, anyway, there's chapters on that. There's a chapter on called Profiting from Destruction, which goes into the whole environmental effects of this, which I think is fascinating to just look into more in depth. There's a chapter called Some Objections Answered, which goes into basically all of the standard objections that people naturally have to these ideas that I'm saying, because people don't want to think of themselves as being cruel or violent or stupid. But so we have these objections that we say, well, you know, Jesus ate meat, so it must be okay, and Indians ate meat, so it must be okay, and plants have feelings too, so what the heck, you kill a carrot, you kill a cow, it's the same thing, or, you know, these basic things. So there's a whole chapter that kind of just look deeply into these things and to help us understand at a deeper level, again, why it's so essential to awaken to our true nature. And the essential teaching is that all of us, all human beings, have been given a gift by the benevolent universe that our bodies require no animal, no other being to die or suffer to feed us. This is an amazing gift, and yet we take this gift and we throw it back in the face of the Creator and say, well, you know, I'm going to eat some meat. And we don't realize the unbelievable devastation that attitude unleashes upon not only others, but it comes back and onto ourselves as well. Cancer, heart disease, not only the physical diseases, the psychological diseases, the social and cultural diseases, it's all connected. The last few chapters go basically into how, when we understand this, it's enormously liberating, and how we can create a world that works for everyone, that it's totally within our reach. And so I just want to close and just thank all of you, really, for making the efforts that you're making to question this official story of our culture. I remember when I was a little kid, I went away to the summer camp in Vermont, and they showed us how to kill our own chicken. I remember, you know, we chopped her head off, and she ran around with no head, you know, and then I put her through the scalding tank, and we ate the chicken. I remember it didn't bother me at all, because at that point I was maybe 12 or 13 years old. I'd gone through 12 or 13 years of intense indoctrination, and I knew beyond the shadow of a doubt that chickens don't have a soul. They were put here by God for us to eat, and they taste good, and if you don't eat them, you will die within 24 hours of a protein deficiency. You know, that's basically it, so you just do it, you know. And, you know, this is the official story that is so prevalent, and it just completely undermines our natural intelligence and wisdom. So when we become vegans, when we switch to a plant-based diet, and we do it at the deepest possible level for spiritual and ethical reasons, and out of a sense of being part of a benevolent unfolding on this planet of life and a celebration of life that we're part of, then we naturally connect, I think, with the greater wisdom that we're here to serve. And once we begin to do that, I think our life begins to move in a whole new way. We begin to be a force for healing on this planet. And each one of us, I think, can find our unique way of contributing to the healing. And so it means really, I think, like a lot of the teachers are starting to emphasize, not just our food, but all of our relationships. That they not be relationships of violence, but they be relationships of kindness and compassion for others. And that as we live that way, through meditation, through connecting in a way, authentic way with nature, through food, you know, all these things, that we can begin to create communities, actually, where I think online communities, local communities, different ways where we can support this. Because I myself, I don't think I ever would have been able to question eating animal foods Because I was, I remember when I was about 7 years old, and I said to my mother, I ate the usual standard American diet, right? And I remember I said to my mother, so is this what everybody eats? And my mother said, yeah, this is what everybody eats. I said, everybody? And she said, yeah, everybody. And then a few minutes later, she said, well, there are vegetarians. And she said it, this is back in the early 1950s. I remember she said it all like, you'll never find one. I mean, they exist sort of theoretically somewhere, but you'll never meet one. That's what I thought. I never thought about it again. I thought maybe in India somewhere, these poor starving people are vegetarians. But I think, and it wasn't until, actually, believe it or not, it's been a lot of talk about the book publishing company, but my brother and I ended up walking from New England all the way to Alabama. We ended up at a Zen Center in Alabama in 1975. But on the way, we lived for about a month, maybe 6 weeks, at the farm in Tennessee. And I found myself in a community of about 1,000 people who were eating a totally plant-based diet. And I remember I worked for the book publishing company, and there was a book by Ina May Gaskins about spiritual midwifery, and taking that book off the press as it came off. And that was how I could become a vegetarian, was because of being with these people and seeing that they were not dying of a protein deficiency. They were vibrant, they were healthy, little kids, vegan from birth, they were doing great. It was so obvious that it was true that you could be healthy and happy and vibrant and joyful and creative on a totally plant-based diet. And when I went to Korea, and I was living there as a Zen monk, I found myself in a Zen monastery in a community that had been vegan for 650 years. So it wasn't kind of like this new California thing. It was an ancient tradition, and it had behind it a very solid ethical component, which is absolutely, I think, the foundation, really, of human peace and happiness. So this is it. This is the frontier for our culture. You're on it. You're the pioneers. And I just want to encourage all of us to continue to move forward. One of the things that I've been really happy to see is that there are groups, all around the country that are springing up. There's actually people giving classes on the World Peace Diet around the United States. We gave one last year. We're giving another one this year, a teacher training class. Right after this conference, actually, see me if you're interested at the Stanford Inn. We're doing a teacher training class for 3 days, 2.5 days. Madeline and I. So if you're interested in becoming a facilitator of the World Peace Diet in your community, because it's really neat to see people in libraries and churches and Whole Foods are giving maybe an 8-week class on the World Peace Diet where people are learning about the deep structure of our culture, and also have it be like a vegan potluck so they learn how to make vegan food, and just kind of spread this wherever you are and create communities, because I think this is the way this revolution is going to happen, the vegan revolution of peace and compassion for all life. It's a benevolent revolution. It's going to happen really at the grassroots level. It's not going to come. I wish it would come through the media from Oprah, but I don't think it is. So at least not now. So we had to do it on this level. So keep up the great work. Much love to all of you, and we're happy to talk to you during the course of the time together. And thank you very much. Thank you. And feel free, if you'd like to, I'm happy to sign books over at the table. Madeline has prints of many paintings of animals, so feel free to talk to her as well. Bless you all. Thanks.